So before we open up Tableau, I'm going to need you guys to download some data files. And I want you guys to go to this website, bit.ly/datafun. Make sure you get the capitalization correctly. Oh man, 215. And you should land at this landing page. Is anyone not here? Awesome. So this is kind of like our landing page for the entire workshop. You can go back to this link later on. It has all the steps that we're going to do today and a lot of additional information in case you're curious. For today, I want all of you guys to download this Tableau workshop zip file. You can click the little download link on the right side of the screen. Go ahead and download that and unzip it in a place that you can access.
I missed it. I was trying to sign in.
Oh, that's fine. 1 second. So you'll want to go to this website, bit.ly/datafun. And then on this page, scroll down until you see Tableau workshop zip. Also, I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize if my voice is terrible. So I'm going to unzip that file and just look at some of the file names in there. So I really like playing with energy data and environmental data. I am an environmental engineering student. I have a background in mechanical engineering and power plant design. So we're going to go through some greenhouse gas emissions data for power plants and other facilities across the US. So the EPA has a big data set where it logs all of the greenhouse gas emissions from every single industrial facility within the United States. And we're going to play with that data set today. So that's kind of exciting. The data, the file that I want to look at first is this GHG-RP data 2014. And I'm not going to open Tableau yet. I just want to look in the data and so that we can understand what we're going to be playing with today. Okay, so I'm opening up this file. You don't have to. Man. So what I'm seeing is we've got some columns like facility ID, FRS ID, facility name, city, state, latitude, longitude. And column K is interesting. This is industry type. Then we have reported CO2e emissions, and then CO2 emissions, methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, all this other stuff. And it looks like every single row in this data set is a separate facility. So it turns out that this data set has a single row for every facility within the United States. And it also has data on the reported CO2 emissions from that facility. Now, real quick, does anyone know what the difference is between CO2e emissions and CO2 emissions? Yes, Blake.
CO2e includes CO2, but also.
Yeah, that's awesome. So there are a multitude of greenhouse gases. Others are like methane and other things like that. And CO2e translates those other emissions into CO2 equivalents. So the equivalent greenhouse gas effect of 1 unit of CO2. And it turns out that these other indicators in this data set, we've got non-biogenic CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. The sum of all of those is going to be the reported CO2e emissions. So the CO2e is kind of an aggregated field, and we have these disaggregated fields, so we can play with that. So before we even start playing with this data set in Tableau, does anyone have any ideas of things that we might look at? What might we want to graph within this data set? One that comes to my mind is we've got lat and long for every facility. So we could map every facility and look at their greenhouse gas emissions. I'm Another one, we can see industry types. So we've got waste industries or power plants. We might look at industries and the average CO2 emissions from that industry. So we've got a lot of stuff that we can look at within this data set. Okay, so now that we have a basic understanding of the data that we'll be working with, I'm going to open up Tableau now. I'm just going to go to Start, open up Tableau. I have Tableau 10.5. I'm going to open that up. Cool. So this is anyone not here? Awesome. So this first screen that we're seeing is kind of like a landing page for Tableau. On the far right side, we've got some like getting started hyperlinks that we can go click on and look at some tutorials. This center space would show any recently opened workbooks, but because I haven't done anything yet, I don't have that. There's some sample workbooks down here, and on the left-hand side of the screen, I have the ability to connect to different data types. Before we start playing in Tableau, I want to show you guys some of the things that we can do in it. So you don't have to follow along, but I'm going to click on looking at this Superstore sample workbook. So I'm going to open it up and I see, okay, we've got this map, and it looks like this map shows profitability for different states. I can scroll over different states and it's very interactive. So I can see Colorado, looks like Littleton has terrible profits. And as you scroll down, other cities have much higher profits. We've got some area charts over here. Shows again, monthly sales by segment, by product category. And we can filter things. So if I want to look at just the South region, I can look at just South by filtering on the right-hand side. There's a lot of different things that Tableau can do like that. So again, another chart, we can do some fun stuff in it. So this is the sort of thing that we'll be developing by the end of today, only we'll do it for CO2 emissions across the United States. I'm going to back out of this, and I'll do that by just clicking this Tableau logo in the top left, show start page. And now you can see this is a recent workbook that I opened. Okay, so the files that we downloaded today are all CSV files. So does that mean I want to connect to an Excel file or a text file? Yeah, so CSV stands for comma separated variable. It's a text file. Although we opened it with Excel to look at it, it's not an Excel file. So in Tableau, I want to connect to a text file. And I'm going to navigate to wherever I unzipped that folder. And I'm going to open this GHG-RP data file. Okay, so this first screen that I see is kind of like it's a data source screen. It's an overview of the data that I'm trying to import into Tableau. If there are any errors with my data set or any obvious problems, this is the screen where Tableau would kind of prompt me about that. But this data is already clean and it's already good to go, so we don't need to worry about that. It does show a preview of the data fields that we were looking at a second ago in Excel. So just once again, it shows the columns that we're looking at. And it's grabbing that first row as the headers. So it's saying, okay, this column is the FRS ID. This column is the address ID, things like that. I'm going to back out of this for a second. Sorry, I'm just going to reopen Tableau because that one looked a little weird. Did anyone else look at a sample workbook on your screen? If you did, you might need to reopen a fresh Tableau file. That was the issue. Okay, so I'm connecting to my GHG-RP data set. It looks good. It looks like we're ready to play with it. So I'm going to go to sheet 1 down here at the bottom where it says go to worksheet. I'm going to click on sheet 1. And this is the main screen of Tableau, and this is where all the action happens. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Let me just walk through what we're seeing. On the far left side of the screen, we have two categories. We have dimensions and measures. And if you look closely, the items under dimensions and measures are all of our column headers in that data file. So under dimensions, we have things like facility ID, FRS ID, state, zip code. Under measures, we have things like reported CO2e emissions and latitude and longitude and things like that. Now, Tableau kind of just guessed at which columns need to go under measures and what should go under dimensions. And the difference doesn't matter too much, but let me explain what the difference between a dimension and a measure is through an example. So say that you are analyzing survey data about Clemson University college experience, and you have things like ethnicity and class standing, so freshman, undergrad, senior, whatever. And you have things like major, but then you also have questions like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with Clemson? Or on a scale of 1 to 10, how sucky is parking for you? Things like that. So the dimensions of that survey are going to be your identifier, the things that identify students. So ethnicity, class standing, major, things that you might want to split out and analyze individually the general responses. So you could say, okay, engineering students are less satisfied with Clemson than art students. You're slicing the data by those dimensions, which are, again, ethnicity or class standing, things like that. Whereas the questions that you're asking on the survey, like satisfaction level or parking satisfaction, those are going to be measures, because those are the measures and those are the things that you're measuring and care about. Does that difference make sense to you? Is that? So within this data set, the dimensions are going to be facility ID, facility name, state, because we might want to look at reported CO2e emissions on a state level. We might want to look at those on a facility specific level. We might want to split out the CO2e emissions, which are a measure, by these different dimensions. So that's the best I can do for explaining the differences. It doesn't matter too much.
So dimensions are like nominal and ordinal data, and then it's continuous data for measures, right? Like ratio and interval?
Yes, although it does not have to be continuous, I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah. You could have, you know, in that survey example, the 1 through 10 could be discrete, but it would still be a measure. But yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. So Tableau does a pretty good job guessing based on the data types. But I actually want to take this latitude and longitude and drag that up to, what did I just do? Drag latitude up to dimensions and longitude up to dimensions. Don't worry about the latitude generated fields, but just take the latitude and longitude from measures and drag it up to dimensions. And that'll help us later on. After this, we don't need to worry about the difference too much. Okay, so other things on this screen, the main canvas, the main area is where graphs are going to start popping up once we start generating them. Question?
I'm clicking and dragging to move those measures.
Okay. I'm gonna check on that real quick.
Oh, not just the other ones. Oh, just that.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can just copy this white space. Yep.
Thank you.
So what I actually want to do is open a new yeah, so this stuff down here is because you opened it. And I did that too. I should have. Okay, so now we need to reconnect to you. So text file, yeah. Okay, so at the top of the screen, we have this, they call it a shelf. So we have a shelf for columns and a shelf for rows, and we'll be messing with those a lot. That's how you put data onto charts. You drag them up to those columns and rows. That's enough to get started right now. So my first research question for this data set is going to be, what's the distribution of CO2 emitters across the US. Seems like a sensible place to start investigating this data. If we wanted a distribution of something, what sort of graph would we need? You can use a bar graph, sure. Yeah, specifically I'm looking for a histogram. Histogram shows distributions, yeah, which is a type of bar graph, sure. So to answer this question, what's the distribution of CO2 emitters across the US? I'm going to play with this reported CO2e emissions measure. So I'm going to click and drag this reported CO2e emissions measure. I'm going to drag it up to the rows shelf all the way at the top of the screen. When I do that, it gives me a single bar. Okay, so I'm looking for a distribution and I only get a single bar. What the heck, Tableau? Just do what I want, right? So what's going on here?
You need columns, you need some way to make distinctions between all different data.
Yeah, I need some bins, right?
Yeah.
I need some bins for the histogram. While a histogram is only 1D, you technically need 2 dimensions to graph it because you need those bin separators. So it turns out that the sum of this bar is 3,082,000,000. And if I were to sum this reported CO2e emissions column in Excel, it says right down here the sum is 3,082,000,000. So what Tableau is doing is it's actually just taking the sum of every single facility's emissions in the US when it generates this bar, because it doesn't really know any better. I haven't told it to do anything differently. So the easiest way to transform this into a histogram is to click this Show Me button in the top right. And the only other chart option that is not grayed out is histogram. So the Show Me button shows all the different basic chart types that Tableau can build. And they're grayed out because I can't graph those types of graphs with only one dimension that I'm working with one measure that I'm working with. But I can create a histogram out of that, so histogram is not grayed out. And I'm going to click histogram. Okay, so that looks like what we're trying to get. We've got a lot of different bins, and within each bin it shows count of the CO2 emissions within that bin. So that tells us something about the distribution. So to me, this says that there are a lot of facilities in the United States that do not emit very much. And there are few facilities that emit quite a lot. And you'll notice that we kind of have 2 dimensions here. We have something on the columns and we have something on the rows within this chart, because Tableau has generated those bins to place facilities into. Is everyone following that? Awesome. So if we look back on our dimensions on the left side of the screen, we can actually see this new dimension that has been generated. And it's called reported CO2e emissions bin. If I wanted to edit the bin sizes, which is something you might want to do on a histogram, I would simply click it, go down to edit, and you can play with your bin sizes right there. I'm just going to leave it as is though. Okay, so our initial research question was, what's the distribution of CO2 emitters across the US? I'm going to modify this a little bit. I'm going to ask instead, what's the regional distribution of CO2 emitters? So rather than a single histogram for the United States, maybe the Southeast has a way different distribution of emitters than the Northwest. And that's the next question that we're going to try and answer. And to do that, we need a regions dimension. Everyone on track with where we're going? Okay. So I'm going to look at my dimensions, and I'm looking for a regions dimension that I can use. So I'm saying, okay, we've got county, we've got city, we've got latitude, longitude, we've got zip code, and we've got state. We do not have regions. Shoot, that's not good. Well, why don't we go ahead and create some regions? We can create a new dimension to play with. Before I go on, I'm just going to rename this sheet. I'm going to rename it from sheet 1. I'm going to right click on it, rename, and rename it histogram. And I'm going to open up a new worksheet. So I'll go to the top where it says worksheet, new worksheet. And this is a new canvas for us to play with. So our task right now is to create some regions and some regions within the United States. And we'll do that by playing with the state dimension. So I'm going to take state and I'm going to drag it to the middle of the canvas and see what Tableau gives me. So Tableau is plotting a data point in the center of every state that has data within this data set. Now, I don't really care about Hawaii, Alaska, or Guam, so I'm going to exclude that data for now. And to do that, I'm going to just click and drag and select Alaska, Hawaii, and Guam. And I'll have 3 dots selected. The rest are kind of grayed out. I'm going to right-click on one of these dots. It doesn't matter which one. And I'm going to click Exclude, because I don't really care about those. Sorry, Guam. For me, my map recenters in the continental United States. If yours does not, you might need to click this little thumbtack button on the graph. But it should recenter automatically. I'm also going to exclude Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So I only care about the continental United States. I'm going to click and drag and select those two. I'm going to right-click and exclude. And I'm going to click this minus button to zoom out once, just so I can see the whole continental United States. Okay, so now we have a map of all the states that are represented within our data set. And our task is to combine those states and group them into regions. So to do that, let's do the Northwest first. I'm going to click and drag and select everything from Wyoming to Washington, so those 5 states. When those 5 states are selected, I'm going to right-click on one of them, and I'll click the Group button. So for me, a color legend has popped up on the right side of the screen, and it says gray is other, and blue is ID, MT, OR, and 2 more. That legend name is not very nice, so I'm going to edit it so that it says Northwest. To do that, I'm going to right-click on this name on the legend. I will edit the alias of that. Now I'm going to call that legend item the Northwest.
What's the difference between edit title and edit alias?
So the title is the title of this legend. Right now it says state parentheses group, whereas the alias is that specific legend entry. That brings me to the next point. If you look on the left side of the screen, we now have 2 dimensions of state. We've got state and then state parentheses group. That second one, the group one, is where we're starting to group all these states together. And that's going to turn into our region dimension. So rather than call it states parentheses group, I'm going to right-click and rename that regions. Now we have state and we have regions. So you can probably guess where we're going with that. We need to create regions for the rest of the United States. You do not have to create the exact same regions that I do, but I'm going to do the Southwest next. So I'm going to click and drag over California to New Mexico. And I'm going to Control-click and add Oklahoma and Texas to it. I'm going to call that the Southwest. So again, I clicked and dragged over the ones that were easy to group together, and then I Control-clicked on Oklahoma and Texas. When I have all of those selected, I will right-click on one of them and click the Group button. And again, we've got a terrible legend entry name. So I'm going to right-click on that orange legend entry, edit the alias, and call it Southwest. Okay, I'll do the Southeast next. I'll go Florida, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. Why not that? I will group all of those together, and I will edit the legend entry to say southeast. Okay, I'll do the Northeast next. I will go from Maine all the way down to Virginia and West Virginia. That's kind of debatable as Northeast, but whatever. Right click on all of those, group them together. I will edit that legend entry and call it Northeast. Okay, finally we got the Midwest. Everything that has not been grouped yet, all those Midwestern states. I will group those together and call it the Midwest. At this point, you should have a very colorful map with every state belonging to one regional group. And we have 5 regions of the United States. Is anyone not here? Awesome. So we did this to create that region dimension so that we could apply that to the histogram and learn what the regional distributions of CO2 emitters are. Before I move on, I'm going to rename this sheet. I will go down to where it says sheet 2, right click, rename, and I'll call this regional map. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my histogram sheet. And ideally, I want a separate histogram for every region that we just generated. To do that, I'm going to grab this regions dimension that we just made. I'm going to drag it onto columns just before reported CO2e emissions. So I'm clicking and dragging regions to just before the reported CO2e emissions. And when I do that, it generates 6 histograms. So we have just instantly delineated a histogram of the entire US to 6 different histograms, 1 for each region of the US. If you look closely, the one on the far right is other. So we have this other region, and we didn't really create an other region when we were grouping things together. Anyone have any idea what's going on there? Awesome. Yeah, Guam, Alaska, Hawaii, all of that is in this other category. Yep, that's exactly right. So when I look at this, it looks like the Southwest has a ton of facilities. The Midwest has a ton of small facilities. There's a couple other interesting trends going on in there. So that's cool. We have answered our question.